Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Chicago Tonight Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. And of course, thank you for spending your afternoon with us. I am Brandis Friedman. Today, we're going to be discussing the unprecedented and that controversial move from 10 years ago when Chicago officials decided to close 50 public schools in 2013. Chicago Public Schools officials said that this was aimed at helping address a $1 billion budget deficit. Now, the majority of these school closures were on Chicago's west and south sides, and it became the largest mass school closure in U.S. history, as we all know today. So we'll be looking at the impact on those communities, the educational outcomes from these closures, and what lies ahead under a new administration. So you all are in a listen-only mode right now, but that does not mean that you can't be part of the conversation. We definitely want to hear from you. So please chime in on the chat function with your questions, your comments, and I'll be sure to get those to our guests. Speaking of our guests, let's introduce them and thank them for taking time out of their busy schedules. Alderwoman Jeanette Taylor of the South Side's 20th Ward. She is also the newly appointed chair of the City Council's Education Committee. Alderwoman, thank you for joining us. Cecile DeMello, Executive Director at Teamwork Englewood. Her team works with residents and stakeholders of Englewood by facilitating economic, educational, and social opportunities. And of course, we know Englewood was definitely impacted by these school closures, so we'll talk to her about some of that. And Natasha Dunn, Executive Director of Black Community Collaborative. Natasha has over 10 years of experience advocating, organizing, and building community awareness for hard to access services in Chicago. She is also a CPS parent, very important role, of course. Thanks to the three of you for joining us. I appreciate it. So let's get into it. The decision to close 50 public schools came despite some strong opposition from educators, parents, and students. All three of you were, of course, on the front lines at the time. Alderwoman Taylor, this was before you became an alderwoman. You were an activist and a parent. Let's start with you, and then Natasha and Cecile, I'll come to you as well. But Alderwoman, what emotions were people feeling when this was first announced?
That it was wrong, and this was not something they should have done. How are you closing schools that you never supported? And so this was not a smart decision. We did not save money. And actually what we lost is bigger than anything because we lost thousands of young people. It has added to the violence in our community, and the system in the city needs to own it. This was a mistake. This was not something that had to be done. After you said that the budget deficit was over $1 million, then you all turned around and spent $1 million on principal training and program. And so I don't understand. And so this was an attack on Black and brown young people and families.
Was it, and as we were looking at the video from 10 years ago, we just saw a shot of you, Alderwoman, protesting at the time outside of the former CPS headquarters with other parents. Cecile, was this very shocking? Was it a surprise at the time?
So I think one thing when we're talking about the mass school closures is we have to remember they were closing schools prior to 2013, dozens of schools every year. So there were a lot of us that have been organizing against school closures, had preliminary data that showed that this was a bad idea before the 50 school closures in 2013. So that's one thing. So really in organizing during that moment, I just felt like it was such a slap in the face for Black and brown people of Chicago because we were doing something we knew wasn't working. We were doing something that we knew was going to be harmful to people who were already in vulnerable situations. And I think the other piece was so many faith-based leaders and media leaders were on the side of saying that this was a good idea. And so it was a really big learning lesson for a lot of us on how both media and elected officials sometimes was taking the story of these school closures and using a different type of propaganda, saying that this was good for us when the people who were being impacted were saying no. And for me, it was like, we should have listened to the people on the ground from the beginning and not skew this story as something different.
Natasha?
Well, to me, what it did was it shined a spotlight on the way systemic racism works. It showed that Black voices really didn't matter. I was at each and every one of the hearings at the time. I organized my community. I organized 2 schools to turn out to the hearings that were being had. And in each hearing, there were hundreds of families, there were teachers, there were community members. It was people who were really trying to elevate their voices to be heard. People came with data, they came with plans, they came with, the desire to really make it work, make the system work for the community, and they didn't listen.
Usually helps if you unmute. Yeah. So we know that, students had to travel farther distances to get to school, after these closures. There were some welcoming schools that were recommended for their school, but I mean, parents had the option. They didn't have to go to those welcoming schools necessarily. What other barriers did the closures pose in that immediate aftermath when families are figuring out their next step?
There was no real plan. They ultimately told one school that you're going to integrate into another school. They gave very little money, and they did the bare minimum to make sure that these schools were merged. It literally was on local school councils and that school community to make those institutions work. And that's not what I get paid for. That wasn't my job. And so there are a lot of lessons learned in this school closing, but the biggest one is now we're left to deal with the violence in our community, the young people who are uneducated, the buildings that are empty or buildings who once housed young people are now apartments. And so what did we really do? We destroyed a generation of young people, but then we'll complain when they're downtown trying to find a safe space. And so this is ultimately what this 50 school closings did, and we're living it. But we told you all this was going to happen.
Right. And then it also destroyed the fabric of our community. When you think of community and you think of community schools and neighborhood schools, you think of schools where families could walk outside of their home and go to the school that's directly accessible to their home. What it did was it shook up our community, and it created barriers in terms of access to quality education. We're now in situations where a neighborhood school, a school that for example, myself pay taxes to, is not my neighborhood school anymore. So my daughter has to travel past 3 or 4 schools to get to school every day. And this is not just me, this is a lot of Black people in the city of Chicago who have chosen to invest and live in Black neighborhoods, but we're not getting the same type of quality access to education as other communities are. The other thing that it did was it really dismantled the relationship the public schools have with the school and the community. When you think about AUSL, some schools were turned around. Like, for example, O'Keefe, which is one of the schools that I organized to come out for the school closures event, they ended up being a turnaround school. It didn't close, but they turned it around. And we fought adamantly against the turnaround because we saw the data was showing that there was growth with the school under the principal who had just became the leader of the school. But instead, they turned it around. And in that process, they fired everyone in the building, all the way down to the lunchroom worker. These are people who lived in the community. And what they did was they hired new people who were not familiar with the community, who was not familiar with the culture of our community, into the schools. And when we look back 10 years later, O'Keefe has plummeted in terms of their data. So we had a school that was moving up the trajectory. Now it's going down.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that point as well. I think one of the things that we have to demystify about the 50 school closures and the dozens of closures before 2013 is that we were not closing necessarily underutilized schools and low performing schools. That was part of the misinformation in that moment. I saw a lot of my work during the mass school closures on the West Side, and I saw us close schools that had been off of academic probation for 10 years and did not have these low enrolled classrooms like was being told. The formula that tells us what is a low enrolled school is a flawed formula. And that was another thing that organizers called out during the school closures. I saw schools who had political connections, including AUSL schools, that were more underutilized and lower performing in the same community not be closed, right? Because it did not really have this rhyme or reason like folks were saying it did. It was definitely a different type of plan. And so I saw these quality, well-performing schools that were using innovation, trying to keep small class size, had utilized their schools as for library spaces and fitness rooms, have all of that extra space counted against them, even though it was providing a well-rounded and holistic education program for their children, now have to take two schools who were not underutilized and make now an overutilized building. We saw culture climate change. We saw conflict between students increase. And we saw parents tired, burnt out, and frustrated was another part. So trying to organize an LSC where you had two schools that had separate governing bodies, now try to be one space, had a lot of issues, right? And so we saw that political momentum from parents also sabotage. So there were a lot of different things that happened. But one of the things I saw on the ground were that we closed schools that were performing and were utilized.
Cecile, is that some of the, because I know that you've done some of your own research, Natasha, you've done some research, right? So yeah, I want to come back to that. Sorry about that. So the school system, they do all this claiming that it's going to help with the deficit, given that these schools are underutilized. But it's in a similar financial shape now as it was a decade ago. $628 million deficit projected for the 25-26 school year. Natasha, you've done some of your own research into educational policy and systemic racism. What have you found was the impact of these closures?
So again, the impact was essentially it created a dynamic where the community no longer has access to their schools in the way that they holistically had before, which the repercussions of that is that now parents travel outside of the community. So the schools that are near the homes are not schools that parents are using. University of Chicago did a study called To and Through, and what they found out was they created something called the dispersion rate. Within the dispersion rate, what they found out was that African-American families travel the furthest out of any other racial ethnic group in the city of Chicago to send their children to school. And then the other key issue that we found is that our schools are inequitably resourced. When you have a student-based budget formula that now says, okay, so first they started off with say, we're going to close the schools because they're underutilized, even though there were schools who had a lot of students in them, it was quote unquote underutilized. Now, because of the repercussions of the closures, we now have schools that actually don't have students in them, because kids travel outside the community. The schools are not resourced. And when the schools are not resourced, then you don't have the opportunity to be able to put the adequate programs in the schools that parents and students need and want to be able to thrive and be successful in. So we've seen that. We've seen the fact that there's been a lot of disinvestment in academic and programs that are achievement programs that are for after school for kids. There's not a lot of those in our schools as well. And so it's really created a trickle down negative impact on our entire community as we speak.
So in West Englewood, 3 schools were closed in 2013. Surrounding areas then lost 27% of their population through 2018, compared with 17% in the rest of the neighborhood. Cecile, do you think that population decline has been a result of these closures? Because, the truth is the city of Chicago, the population was declining, particularly in the Black community, even before the closures.
I definitely think it was a big factor around that. The closures created a lot of destabilization in communities. And another piece that sometimes we don't talk about, which was another repercussions, is the vacant schools that then were vandalized and created even more disinvestment in these communities. Who wants to live across the street from a school that's being consistently vandalized and now became an eyesore and a problem around safety as well? So it was just another symbol to families that this is no longer a community that feels safe for you because of the actions of our elected officials in those moments. And like I said, not just 2013, but the years leading up to 2013. And for Englewood, you also have to remember a few years later, all of our high schools were closed for the Englewood STEM high school. So it just doesn't make people feel like this is a place that I can stay, invest in, raise my family. And something that Natasha said that I think is important, there are a lot of families that continue to be resilient and to fight for their communities despite all of this disinvestment we've had to live through.
And I definitely want to get to the, the buildings and the use of those buildings and how many of them are sitting empty in just a little bit. But before we do that, so Alderwoman Taylor, you, along with some other activists, you all made headlines a few years later when you went on a month-long hunger strike to save Diet High School, which was on the verge of closure separately. In these kinds of situations, how should CPS assess schools that that aren't enrolled, to as much as that building or that school might be able to handle, instead of opting to close the school as the solution to it being so-called under-enrolled?
They should do their job and put students first. We are not data points. You don't look at us on the screen. If they would have came to those buildings and saw those families, my mother was a CPS clerk for 30 years, who went to work at 7 o'clock because you had families who had to be at work at 8 and did not have anybody to watch their children, because she was dedicated to her community and the people there. And so because CPS looks at us as a spreadsheet, they don't know what goes on in these buildings. And so they didn't do what they needed to do. And so going on a hunger strike in 2015, why would a young person think this city cares about them? Why would a parent think that this city, which is why you got an exodus of us that just leave? And so going on a hunger strike, to me, let me see what type of monster this city really is. And we never talked about what did they do to help any of these schools. The story of Diet is it was a high-performing middle school that, with no reason other than closing schools in Englewood, that they turned into a high school and didn't give them as much as extra $5 in the budget. And so CPS needs to do its job, which is put community and young people first, not closing public schools, because that's what
give me a sense of what that means to you, or what that looks like to you. I mean, should it be a matter of, Cecile, you look like you've got something to say.
Right. The schools, you can't put schools in a box. Every school has different needs. Every community has different needs. And it depends on the young people and the families that you're servicing. And so CPS never does that work. Think about this. Mollison merged with Overton Elementary. Overton Elementary was the higher performing school. It had the bigger building, but they chose to merge them inside of Mollison. And we didn't even have a space for the nurses. The kids ate lunch in the gym room. We didn't have a special ed classroom. Who makes decisions like that for young people when you really care? Now, Chicago Public Schools has the saying, putting children first. That's not who you put first, especially not in our communities.
I was going to follow up with that piece. This piece about thinking about buildings and what happens in buildings and children being first in buildings, it brings me back to one of the things that happened in the timeline of the school closures. I was a part of the work that passed the 2011 legislation for a comprehensive community plan on CPS buildings. And they asked for this plan to be postponed in November of 2010 so that Barbara Burr Bennett at the time could get her bearings together and begin to really look at how she could create a comprehensive plan. But what ended up happening is during that quote unquote pause to create this community plan for buildings, they did the school closures. Had the pause not been allowed at the state legislature at that time, legislation at that time, they would not have been able to do the school closure because the law mandates for you to look at what is going on in community. How can you connect community plans to the buildings? How do you explore other uses for building space if a school is underutilized? And how do you increase the academic performance? So when we talk about schools and a lot of things like STEM sometimes get thrown around in fine arts, you have to have a building that creates the opportunity for that curriculum to really be actualized. And so when we're talking about this building doesn't have enough space, yeah, that building also doesn't have a science lab. It also doesn't have a library. It also doesn't have an art room. This is how we have to think about the buildings and how children are learning in buildings. Is the building accommodating them in addition to its repairs and things like that? So the thinking around the mass school closures and just making it about numbers and spreadsheet completely dismissed how we're supposed to actually be thinking about the buildings as anchor institutions, and the opportunity for children and families to grow and learn makes it not about a spreadsheet and more about appropriate planning with community.
I want to remind our participants that that you all can chime in as well in the chat function or the Q&A function, and let us know what you're thinking, what you would like to ask our guests, and of course, I'll be sure to get those questions over to them. Okay, so as we said, pivoting to the buildings, which we've already kind of done, residents were also promised that the former buildings would be transformed into community assets and not be used for charter schools, which that that is the case. They have not been used for charter schools, but I think it's up for debate whether or not they've been transformed into something useful by the community, because WBEZ and the Sun-Times are reporting that less than half of those buildings have been repurposed at all. More than half are still sitting idle. Alderwoman Taylor, what does this tell you? And you know, as an alderwoman and the head of the Education Committee and City Council, what is your plan to speed up the process of getting these buildings into something useful?
So in the 20th ward, we're creating a plan. We have a community development team, which is 15 people who help me look at development and make decisions. And so what we're going to do is first talk about what those buildings meant to the community. Imagine going to a school that you can't go back to. And so you went to elementary school, you have these memories, you can't go back to them because they're closed. And so what we want to do is honor what those schools used to be and allow the community, let me say that clear, the community decide what those buildings become. Because to Natasha's point, we pay taxes on them, we pay for them, they are our buildings. And so those are institutions we should decide. Cecile is so humble. She's actually turned one of the closed schools into a space where the community can actually do programming, where they can have youth work, where we can do things. And so that's what the city of Chicago needs to do. And as the education chair, what we're going to start to do with CPS and with City Colleges of Chicago is work through transparency. See, there's a lot, and we're asking for forensic audit for both spaces. We don't know what they spend the money on. We just don't, there's so much that we don't know because previous administrations have covered CPS's butt every time. And so we don't know what they spent COVID money on. We don't know what the budget goes on. And so we're going to start off those conversations around transparency, seeing what we actually have. Because to Cecile's point, a lot of this line about the school closings said that she was going to close one building to put kids in a better performing building. And we know that didn't happen. And so once we honor what those spaces are, what those schools used to be, we ask the people, whoever decides, the community says, hey, this is what we want to see the building become, that there is a space in the school that honors it being a high school or elementary school or whatever it was, so that people never forget that these buildings were once institutions of inspiration. And because of greed, and let's not leave out Baba Bird Bennett went to jail. Let's not forget that part. And so let's not forget that these buildings meant something to us. They were spaces where we grew up in, where we had the notes we used to pass. I like you, you like me. Where you went to gym, where you ate lunch, where you learned to be a young person.
And there's certainly obviously all of the nostalgia and the sentimental value, and like you said, honoring the spirit of the community. And since you brought it up, I want to ask Cecile about the work that she's doing, and then Natasha will come back to you. But Cecile, you're a part of that team of Englewood grassroots organizations that has plans to repurpose the former Granville Woods Academy into a 48-unit housing facility. Tell me a little bit about how that process and how you managed to pull that off.
Sure. It was one community meeting right on the site, and city officials came and said, oh, we can't do this because we have to send it out to bid. We have to do this. We have to do that. And our team went back and said, when we're creating systems where it doesn't allow for nonprofits to jump in and do this economic development, right, it's time to redo those systems, right? A lot of times there's confusion between what is lawful around what we can do in the city of Chicago and what are the practices that we pretend are lawful, right? And so we've been able to challenge them about, we have to create the opportunities for community groups to step in this place and not uphold bureaucratic protocols and systems that don't allow for this to happen. So we shouldn't have to wait to do these kind of different protocols to be able to do the work. And I'm really grateful for the Go Green Out Racing team. We've been staying diligent on it. We've been making the city think differently about how to dispose of buildings and how to use buildings. In my work that I've done in community organizing, one thing I know is that sometimes the city can get in its own way of being creative and innovative and being able to uplift the community and give us an opportunity to spread our wings and do something different. So that's the kind of the story of the Woods Elementary Schools. We brought them to the site and said, listen, that's not going to do. We have to think differently. For Harper was the same thing. When we approached Chicago Public Schools with community groups, we said, listen, we don't need another vacant school in our community that gets tore up. We need to be able to do it. And the question was, why not? Why can't you give us this opportunity? If you can't answer that, then we should be able to move forward. And so that's how we've been able to build that partnership. And I really hope moving forward, with the new administration, we think about what are we doing that we get in our own way of not allowing community to be able to manifest something new with these buildings.
Natasha, CPS CEO Pedro Martinez has blamed the pandemic for the redevelopment delays, but says that he's looking forward to working with Mayor Brandon Johnson on this. What would you like to see done, and what are you hopeful that this new administration can do?
Well, let me back up real quick and say that I am all for data and stats. I think it's very important that our community at least understand how the system operates and how it looks at the community, because when we are informed about the way people are seeing things and the way data is being rolled out, I think that helps us to be able to work collaboratively with the system to really create solutions that are culturally based. And recently the district came out with some test data, and we learned that since the pandemic, Black students specifically had the lowest reading and math scores. It essentially erased almost four decades of data of achievements that our students have received over the years. And it also has erase some of the achievements that occurred within the 20-year process in reading and math. So now we're at a point where we can see why our community is struggling the way it's struggling. We can also see why we have so much issues with students going downtown and having these different radical situations happening where they're somewhat destroying the city, when in fact, when we know what's really happening is the fact that there's these years of disinvestments in our community and the lack of proper protocol in terms of ensuring that our students are able to close the gaps. We need to work with the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago needs to work with the Black community, because at the end of the day, it's our community that's suffering at every data point. And I would like to see, and we've actually tried to meet with Pedro Martinez in the beginning of the school year to talk about this data. We even introduced him a plan that in Los Angeles, they have a Black student achievement task force and plan we tried to introduce for Chicago. They're targeting Black schools and students and really creating a culturally competent solutions to be able to close the gaps. And I think I would like to see that here in Chicago. We will work with the city as long as they work with us, but if not, we're just going to have to, take it back. And in terms of the buildings in our community in South Shore, just recently, the city of Chicago tried to put migrants in one of our closed school buildings, and we stood against it. And the reason why we stood against it is because the city promised that would be a building that would be used for the community. And again, the community came up with plans for that building. And of course, it was ignored. So we stood up, and we do plan to reintroduce those plans again and work with the city so that we can create a space that's going to be for us.
So one more question, Cecile, is, the status of some of these buildings right now. It's been 10 years, right? They've been sitting idle. These were big buildings. They were probably fairly old in the first place, and they're not in very good shape now. I think the Granville building had been heavily vandalized. I think some copper had been stolen out of the walls, among other materials. What are the challenges with securing funding for something like that?
I'm glad that you brought that up, because one of the other areas where the city can get in its own way is how do we have opportunities for investment? Both right now, we have this opportunity with recovery dollars. We have this opportunity on having allies at the federal level, at the state level, where we can create opportunities for investment around these things. We find ways to fund other large projects in the city of Chicago. We can be able to steer funding and support and earmark dollars for the feasibility studies that need to be done to help all of the groups that already have plans, like Natasha said, that have been building these plans. How do we support their capacity to facilitate these things? And so as someone who's been studying the way we have repurposed buildings and monitoring all of this, I've seen the city of Chicago do everything from Lincoln Yards being able to be financed to the casino being able to get support in the city. We have the opportunity. We just need the political will to make that connection. So, in the words of Tom Tressler, the city's not broke. And so we have to be able to think about what are the means that we can do this. And hopefully with this new leadership, we can have the priorities of a budget that represents the needs to address these buildings, and also to address the future of buildings in Chicago Public Schools. Right now, we're up against the new timeline for another 10-year plan around buildings. We should be working with communities right now to say, what do your buildings need? Principals, what do you need? Teachers, what do you need? Youth, what do you need your buildings to be able to do for you? Because the 2018 trailer bill we did, you can't do a school closure like we thought. I've been seeing a lot of the media talk about, oh, we've got difficult decisions ahead. I already say that kind of framework is not the framework we need. We have opportunities ahead, and we have to be thinking differently about our buildings, differently about our community plans, and create the political will. We can do this. It can be done. Other cities do this. They do the appropriate planning. They look at that repurposing from the lens of a community development approach. We can do it. We just have to have that political will.
I want to take another minute and remind the participants who are in our audience that you're welcome to drop us a question if you've got one, and I'll be sure to share it with our guests. And we've got about 8-10 minutes left. I want to get to kind of what's coming up next, because the moratorium on closing any additional schools that's set to expire in January of 2025, so a year and a half. Still a decade after these closures, though, CPS is facing problems with under-enrolled public schools. Natasha, you're also a CPS parent. This is personal to you. Bless you. How do you hope the new administration will deal with school funding issues and inequity?
Well, again, I hope that they would work with the community directly and allow for there to be that feedback and the plans that communities who have been disinvested in years be prioritized. And that's the focus, because, at the end of the day, most of us are sick and tired of being sick and tired, specifically Black people. We are in this perpetual cycle of trauma, of oppression, of harm, of disinvestment. It's a perpetual cycle, and we want it to end now. So we believe that we should be prioritized, and we want the system, we want the people who are in power to work with us to make sure that happens.
Cecile, you've gone about creating a policy that makes CPS take preventative measures before deciding to shut a school down. Tell us about that. And, how concerned are you that, CPS has to announce, we're doing this again, everybody?
Yeah, so the 2018 legislation actually makes it so that the district has to prove that they did an intervention to address enrollment prior to school closures. So even as the moratorium ends, this legislation is that backup legislation that would make the district accountable, and they would have to prove to the public and elected officials that they did those interventions. The reason we thought about this policy work around interventions is because, for example, what happened in Englewood with the high schools. The district knew that we had under enrollment, and with student-based budgeting as how we divvy out funds, it is problematic that the district doesn't do interventions when they know that low enrolled schools are in predominantly African-American communities, and they're not getting the resources they need because of both the student-based budget policy as well as the under enrollment. So the bill makes that the district has to create those interventions, like, does this school need to be a sustainable community school? Does this school have community school partners? Should we work with the community to create a new curriculum that will make the school more attractive? If there does need to be a boundary change, how can the community work together to create a safe and positive boundary change if that's the need? There are so many tools in our toolbox that we can use around increasing enrollment in schools by listening to what families and communities want for that building and what kind of other creative things. Another piece that I've been a proponent for, but the district has been slow to integrate is, how do we think about joint use, right? Other districts do this. How do you put in maybe an agency from the city that's needed in that community to share space with that school? We do this a lot with clinics, right? But we haven't thought bigger than the clinics. How can we have other kind of provisions inside of spaces? The last thing I'll share is populations are changing across the city of Chicago. We should be prepared for that as well. We should be looking at population projections. We should be looking at the growing early childhood needs that exist inside of communities. These are all how you make sure that you're planning for the future of the buildings in the city of Chicago by looking at the data and looking at the community needs and bringing that all together. But I just want to say, if they think that we can just do school closures like we did before, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, you would think that based on how that was received, they would think differently about that. So CPS fell from being the third largest district in the U.S., though, down to fourth place, now behind LA, New York, and Miami-Dade County. Alderwoman Taylor, how do you think Mayor Johnson should handle the issues of declining student populations, aging buildings in need of repair, budget deficits, and how are you going to be working with him from your position?
So really to talk about what we have, because we don't know honestly what we have. We don't know what's open. We don't know what's closed. We don't know how many students. We don't know how many teachers. We don't know how many paraprofessionals. We don't know how many therapists. And so we need to look at our portfolio. That's number one. And be transparent and honest about what we have and don't have. Number two, we need to see what that budget is. CPS got a lot of money during COVID. We don't know what those dollars are. We don't know what they spent them on. We still had kids who didn't get iPads or access to internet during COVID. And so we got to have a real conversation about what we have, but then say and ask the school community, ask the community how those dollars should be spent. Harold Washington is the person who came up with local school councils. And he said he came up with that concept because he said schools should have local accountability. And so Chicago Public Schools needs to listen. And so I'm excited because I've known Brandon for 20 years, but we also got to hold them accountable. We know what type of mess we're living in. And think about this, in 2025, we're going to get an elected school board that we've been fighting for decades. And so we got some things that are in our favor. But the biggest thing that we got to do is listen to the folks in the community. Some people, this was going to happen when they closed the schools. We did this. This was not a surprise. This wasn't no, oh, I didn't know. But how are you going to repair that harm? You know how many young people have gotten killed because of those school closings? You know how many people lost their jobs and moved? And we're not talking about the exodus of Black teachers. You took away these children, other parents. Schools were the last stable foundations we had in our community, and they threw a grenade in them. And so now we got to figure out, as usual, how to make lemonade out of lemons, like we always do as the Black community. Difference is this time our young people, they different than us. They are way different than us. You ain't turning your water hose on them. You ain't turning your dogs on them. We got a different generation, but we also need to bring them to the table to ask what the needs are. We waste so much money thinking we know. I don't know. I don't have a clue what young people go through these days. And so, but I'm woman enough and smart enough to sit at the table with them and make those decisions with our community.
Almost out of time, but I want to give Cecile and Natasha an opportunity for some closing thoughts as well. And also, you know, like, as you've mentioned, the elected school board, you know, that's going to be happening fairly soon. And what faith do either of you have that, you know, because Alderwoman Taylor brought up the LSCs, right? So now we're going to have this other injection of sort of community control a little bit. Like, do you have a little bit of faith that the schools will be governed better or differently, more to the way the communities would like to see them with the election of that elected school board? And Natasha, I'll come to you first, please.
I have mixed faith in that process because it kind of started off weak in terms of the engagement of the community the way it should have. A lot of people in the Black community literally didn't even understand that there was an elected school board, what that entailed, the process. There's this mapping discussion that's going on, trying to make sure that the districts are equitably laid out. And we know based on history that oftentimes Black people are gerrymandered out of power. And so there's another layer of bureaucracy and potential problems that could happen with that. But again, on a brighter side, depending on how that looks, we will have an opportunity to hopefully elect people on the board that represents the community and the community needs, and the voices should be heard and in a way where we can make some positive changes within the system. But again, it all goes back to the whole concept of ensuring that community is working in tangent with our system. We pay taxes, we are a part of the system, we control the system, but the system has to understand that we are partners too. And so we just want to be able to see that it worked for us for a change and that our communities are prioritized.
Yes, I'm both cautiously optimistic, very similar to Natasha. I'm a CPS mom of 3. And but what I understand the work the elected school board. I was part of the referendum work a few years ago. And but outside of that, I know, first of all, that democracy is messy. And I do know that when we do the work of the elected school board, there's going to be a lot of competing thoughts and ideas, and it's going to be bumpy. And I'm looking forward to that as well, too. You know, people are already saying that it's going to be a mess, going to be this. Democracy is like that, right? And so I'm not going to let that distract me. But what I am clear on is that the advocacy from parents and community leaders has to be consistent with or without the elected school board, right? And I'm such an admirer of these two women here and their work and our work collectively to still call out the system, because the elected school board will be able to do some work, but I think it's going to be a slower process. We're still going to have to be able to push the needle on some key things as the elected school board work continues to morph and be able to be its final product, right? We have to call out now that we need a strong 10-year master facility plan. We need right now to call out that we need a plan for the closed schools, and we need a plan for academic performance in Black communities now, not in 2025 and not in 2026. We need those things right now. And I am hopeful for the grassroots movements that I've always leaned into to be able to call this out and get this done.
Okay, that is where we'll have to leave it. My thanks to the three of you for being our guests today and for sharing your knowledge, your experience, your insights. We are out of time. So thanks to our panelists, Alderwoman Jeanette Taylor, Cecile DeMello, and Natasha Dunn. And of course, thanks to our viewers for participating in today's Black Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. We are going to share a short form in the chat. And if you could click it, please submit your ideas, the topics, story ideas, issues that you think we need to be addressing. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please join Chicago Tonight Black Voices, which airs on Fridays at 10 p.m., as well as Chicago Tonight Latino Voices, which airs Fridays at 5:30. Both shows also air Saturday at 6 and 6:30, with Latino Voices at 6 and Black Voices at 6:30. Thanks again to our guests for joining us, and thanks to all of you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.